In this part of the tutorial, we're going to be looking at allowing the user to actually create an album. Now before we start, we need to add an option to the top menu to allow the user to click this. We already have one present. Once the user is logged in here, we can click Create Albums. This will take us to createalbum.php. However, we want to add this to the menu as well. So let's go ahead and come down here. I'm going to say create a link. This is going to be create album, and in here it's create _ album.php, and we'll just put a / there. So now that we've done that, we're allowed to we're allowing our user to click on create album. This will take them to createalbum.php, which doesn't yet exist. So we're going to go ahead and set this up. So let's create a new page. Let's save that in our root directory as create _ album.php. Now you'll probably notice that I've opened up album.func.php. This is our list of defined functions, and we're going to be filling in some of these in this part of the tutorial. So inside create album, the first thing we need to do is include the initialization file, so that's init.php. We also need to include the header, so template / header.php, and down here we want to include the footer, so that's template / footer.php. Let's just create them in separate blocks, and we can go ahead and start to write out our HTML. So in header tags, I'm just going to write create album, and if we go back to our browser, click on create album, that's automatically created our create album page. So underneath this, we need to obviously create a form. So let's go ahead and start to write our form out. The action is going to be blank because we are posting to the current page. The method, as always, is going to be post. End the form, and we can start to write out our fields. Now the first field is going to be the title of the album. So we can say name, breakdown, and create a input field. The type's going to be text, and we're going to call this album name, so album _ name, and we're also going to have a max length on it. Now you'll probably remember in the registration part we put a max length so the users couldn't type over a certain amount of characters. In this case it's 55. We'll also be including checks when we validate our input to make sure both of these fields are within their boundaries with regards to the length of the text. Okay, so now we want to create an area to write the description. So we say description. This time we're creating a text area as opposed to a text input field. And let's go ahead and define some properties for this, or some attributes for this. The name is going to be album _ description. And we're going to make this a bit larger than standard, so we're going to have rows of 6 and columns 35. That will give a nice area to type in. We're also going to set a max length of 255, as that's what we have defined in our database. Lastly, we need a submit button to be able to click and submit these fields. So we create an input type of submit with the value of create. Okay, so let's go ahead and preview this in our browser. It looks okay, so we can type a name in here and a description in here, click create, it'll submit, and we can start to validate in PHP. So the PHP will just be here, just underneath the header, but before the form. And we need to run across the pretty much same thing we've been doing with all of our form validation. The first thing we're going to do is actually set or check the album name and the album description are set. And the first thing we need to check for is album name. Remember, we named this album name down here. And also $_ post album description. And if these two are set, we can continue with the validation. Now we're going to reset the variables as we have before. So album name is equal to $_ post album name. And again, we can just copy and paste this down and change these around to suit our description that we've posted as well. So again, we're not going to sanitize this before we enter it into the database. We're going to let our function do that. We're going to validate the input before it's been sanitized, and just sanitize when we call the function to create the album. So now let's create an errors array, which is going to hold our errors if we do have any, so that's equal to an array. And then we can come down and start to validate our input. So the first thing we're going to do is check if these fields are empty. So we're checking if empty album name or empty album description. If either of these are empty, then obviously we have a problem because they are both required. So we can add an element to this array, and we can just say album name and description required. Okay. Otherwise, we can start on our other validation, assuming they've typed both of the name and the description. We can then start to validate it in other ways. Now, the only thing we're going to be doing is checking the string length of both of these, just in case anyone decides to try and modify the HTML page. So this is the only thing we're checking. Obviously, we're using the errors array in case you did need to add other validation as well. For example, a minimum amount of characters, but we won't be looking at that in the tutorial because you should be able to go ahead and adapt that for your own use. So the check that we're carrying out is if the string length of the album name is greater than, and I think we set it to 55, yeah, in the database it's 55, or the string length of album description is greater than 255, then we can add another element to the array. Obviously it will only be either one or the other because of how we've set our if statement up. The logic of it will be that we only ever get one error, but if you wanted to add more errors, you would add more if statements down here and then just add more elements to the array. So this can just say one or more fields contains too many characters. Okay, so underneath here we can again use the same if statement to check if our errors array is not empty, and if so we can echo out the errors just here. So for each errors as error, we can go ahead and just echo out error and then a break after that. So this should be quite familiar now because we've done this twice before. Okay, so otherwise we need to call our function create album. Now we obviously haven't created this function yet, we haven't created the contents of the function, but we'll go ahead and actually write it out anyway. So create album. If we refer back to album.func.php, you can see that we take an album name and description. That's the only thing we've required, so that's the only thing that we need to pass to this function. So album name and album description. So once we've done that, we can relocate the user. So we locate them or transfer them, redirect them to albums.php, which we haven't created yet. That's in the next part of the tutorial. So obviously this function is not going to work at the moment because we haven't actually created it, but to do this is quite simple.